Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute and the Resnick Hospital Board of Advisors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Open Mind program with Dr. Kelli Harding, author of the new critically acclaimed book, The Rabbit Effect: Live Longer, Happier, and Healthier with the Groundbreaking Science of Kindness. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Harding here with us today, joining us from her home in New York City to give us an eye-opening and inspiring new way to look at our health based on the latest discoveries in the science of compassion, kindness, and human connection, which feels especially relevant right now, having just lived through the isolation of a pandemic. Dr. Harding is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She is a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. She holds a master's degree in public health and is also board certified in the specialty of psychosomatic mind-body practice. Dr. Harding dedicates her time to teaching medical students, seeing patients, writing, and educating the general public about health and wellness. She has appeared on The Today Show, Good Morning America, on NPR, the BBC, and her work has been featured in many prestigious publications such as the New York Times, US News and World Report, and Psychology Today. Dr. Harding will be joined in conversation by Dr. Daniel Fessler, inaugural director of the UCLA Badari Kindness Institute. Dr. Fessler is a professor of biological anthropology at UCLA, working in the fields of evolutionary psychology, anthropology, and medicine. We would like to thank both of our distinguished scholars for taking the time from their extraordinarily busy schedules to share their knowledge and expertise with us today. A quick announcement before we get started. Our next Open Mind program will be held on Tuesday, June 15th, 5 p.m. Pacific time, when we welcome an extraordinary father-daughter duo. Dr. Dilip Jesti, world-renowned neuropsychiatrist and pioneer in the exploration of the neurobiology and psychology of wisdom, and the author of the new book, Wiser: The Scientific Roots of Wisdom, Compassion, and What Makes Us Good. He will be joined in conversation by his esteemed daughter, Dr. Shefali Jesti, pediatric neurologist and professor in psychiatry, pediatrics, and neurology at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Please visit our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org, to see a complete listing of all our upcoming Open Mind programs. There you will also find a link to our YouTube channel, which is a complete library of videos from all our past Open Mind events. Today's program is being taped and will be available for viewing there tomorrow. Just one more note, the last segment of today's program is reserved for your questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible during the time allotted. And now please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Kelli Harding and Dr. Daniel Fessler. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Vicki, and thanks to the Friends of the Semel Institute for having us. Kelli, welcome virtually to UCLA. I'm so excited to talk to you. And thank you, everyone who's watching, for joining us in what I think is a very important and timely discussion. As Vicki mentioned, Kelli is the author of this book right here. Really a remarkable volume that combines very personal experience and an incredible encyclopedic compendium of scientific findings, ranging from state-of-the-art, hot off the presses, to really important work over the past decades. Kelli, to begin with, explain for the audience why the book is called The Rabbit Effect. What is that, and how does that summarize the message that you're trying to get across here?
Sure. So actually get a lot of people asking if the book is about rabbits, but it's gets its title from an old study that was actually done in the late 1970s by a lovely researcher by the name of Dr. Neeram, who looked at rabbits. So if you like, I can tell you about that study.
Yes, please. I think that captures really one of the core take-home messages of the book. So let's explore that a little bit, and then get into the process of the book and some of the details.
Okay, sounds good. And also, I have a little snippet to read if you would like me to as well, Dan.
Absolutely, yes. I think that will give the audience a great taste for the book and what it's about.
Okay, sounds good. Well, first about these rabbits, because people are probably wondering what is the story with these rabbits. So the story goes basically that this researcher, a basic science researcher, was looking at heart health in rabbits, and so he and his team fed these virtually genetically identical rabbits, all the same high-fat diet, and they expected all the rabbits to have the same poor heart health outcomes. This was around the time that there was a lot of questions in the late 1970s around cholesterol and heart health. So much to his dismay, one of the groups that he was studying had vastly different outcomes to the other groups. And he realized, at first he thought there was something wrong with the protocol, being a good researcher, and he looked for what was going on. He couldn't find it. And then they looked up and they looked at the people who were participating in the research. And it turned out all the rabbits who fared better, and we're talking pretty dramatic differences in their outcomes, had all been cared for by the same kind, considerate researcher. And much to their credit, they decided, could it be that somehow the social environment's actually getting under the skin and changing physiology? So they repeated the experiment, this time with very tightly controlled conditions. And sure enough, it turned out that the rabbits that were receiving not just kibble, were also getting love and kindness, had far better health outcomes. This study was done a long time ago. It was revolutionary in its time. And like many medical studies, it ended up more or less sitting in the medical journals a lot of times. And what's striking about this study, and for me personally, it was very transformative because it helped me get across the street at the medical center at Columbia from the medical center over to the School of Public Health. And, I sort of felt like Alice going through the looking glass, seeing this entirely new world of looking at health from a very different way. And I realized there were decades of studies that supported the outcome of the rabbit studies. So it nicely illustrates it.
Right. So the sort of key point there is that the determinants of health don't stop at the skin, that it is our interaction with those around us that is really an important factor in the case of the rabbits, their physiological health, and in the case of many of the studies that you cite, both physiological and mental health in human beings. So you mentioned crossing the street and going for that other degree with an M, the public health degree, a really important complement to your medical degree. Perhaps you could read that excerpt now, and we can talk a little bit about your personal journey and how your own experiences interweave in the writing of the book with the scientific material that you're reporting on.
Absolutely. So let me share that now. So I'm going to read a section that's from the chapter on neighborhoods. And it starts with a quote that actually, just for a second, if we wanted to pause and think about, because I think it's going to be quite relevant to the discussion we're going to have. It says, "Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can." And that's a quote by Arthur Ashe that I just love.
A UCLA alum, I will add.
Yes, I realized. For my 6th birthday party, my parents hired a magician. In our cramped basement, Mr. Magnificent wowed the crowd with colorful handkerchief tricks and by pulling a white rabbit from a hat. For his final act, he called me to the front of the room. With the tap of a wand and a flash of his cape, he revealed a small, round glass bowl with a beveled edge. It contained a present for me, one single goldfish. Delighted by the big-eyed creature, I named him Snoopy. The next morning, I excitedly ran to the living room to see my new pet. I found Snoopy floating on his side, cause of death unknown. Like many party favorite goldfish, the festivities ended abruptly. To soothe my tears, my mom hugged me and said, "Honey, goldfish just don't live that long. It was his time." A couple of summers after Snoopy's untimely demise, my parents rented a Tudor-style vacation house in San Diego. The magical house came with indoor swings, an old tabby cat named Felicia, and an outside concrete fish pond in the backyard. Felicia and I spent afternoons watching the large, bright orange fish swirling in the water in perpetual motion. Felicia, not a water lover by nature, couldn't resist dipping her paw in to bat at the lively creatures. The poker-faced fish moved out of the way unfazed. Sitting beside the pond in California, I couldn't believe that these magnificent hardy animals living in the backyard were sickly Snoopy's cousins. Goldfish could thrive. As it turns out, the widely shared assumption that all goldfish die young is an illusion. Goldfish can live 20 to 30 years. They can outlive most dogs and cats. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the oldest recorded domestic goldfish named Tish died at 43 years old in 1999. On that fateful day, he was set to rest in his owner's flower garden in a yogurt container. Tish and another fish called Tosh were a carnival prize awarded to a young British boy named Peter in 1956. Tosh died in 1976 at the age of 22. Tish lived to see Peter move out of the house, get married, have a mortgage. Peter's mom continued to care for Tish and chatted to him daily as a member of the family. In retrospect, Snoopy's untimely death after only one day had nothing to do with the average goldfish lifespan. Instead, the culprit seems something much more fundamental, something important that Tish and Tosh had in common with the robust goldfish I met in California, and something Snoopy lacked. The fish that thrived had a rich environment. They weren't toted around in little plastic baggies to only end up trapped in a small party fish bowl. The Californian fish had an entire pond to play in, and Tish lived with caretakers who ensured his environment helped him thrive too. All things must successfully navigate their environment to live. For a human being, that's our neighborhood. Ben was a retired elementary school custodian in his late 60s with a kind smile, a soft voice, and snow white hair. His wife, Sophie, had died of breast cancer 4 years before I saw him in our primary care residence clinic. Ben and Sophie had been close companions, and Ben missed having Sophie to talk over dinner and to accompany him on strolls in Central Park. In the years that Ben had lived alone in their apartment since Sophie's death, his metabolism had become out of whack. His blood glucose levels were out of control. He'd become extremely overweight and complained of bad knees. Ben lived in a second floor walk-up, and it took him 15 minutes to get up and down the stairs. Now, without his wife at his side, it was difficult for him to get out and about. Ben's father was also severely overweight, and after going blind, he eventually died from complications relating to diabetes. Ben wondered if he had inherited the family curse. Ben patiently listened as I told him about the great opportunity to change his diet, eat more healthy green vegetables, and exercise more. At the time, it was my standard lifestyle lecture, passionately espousing the medical community's mantra of fewer calories and more exercise. It's that same tack that expensive public service campaigns take, aiming to teach people how to eat healthy. But at this point, don't we all know that broccoli is better than a donut? When it comes to weight and health, there are hidden factors that play well beyond willpower alone. Thank you.
So excellent. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone gets a taste for this. what Kelli has read is some of the sort of personal experience aspect, which is interwoven then with the science. And critically, you mentioned environment. So let's talk about environment and the effects of the environment on health. Obviously, part of that is the physical environment. And I think, probably most folks are aware of that, diet being one component, pollution versus clean air, clean water, noise, and so on, right? But critically, and maybe this is where we're a little different than Snoopy, the social environment really matters for people. So talk a little bit about how in your clinical practice and in your reading of the scientific literature, you see social interactions as really key to health and very much a relationship between the individual, their immediate circle, and then their larger community.
So Dan, exactly what you described was my whole reason for writing the book, in the sense that it felt like there is so much research and data out there in terms of how our social environment impacts our health in all the different areas of our lives, from our homes to our schools, our workplaces, our broader communities. And it felt almost like the rabbit study in some ways. It was sort of sitting in a journal, and it felt like it really needed to sort of get out there to the public. And so that was my goal, was to try to personalize it in a way, make stories that are engaging, get the research told, because I think the reality is, it's like we are enmeshed in this social infrastructure that's impacting each of our health every single day. So, just on that note, I mean, where do we begin? It's quite profound, and you're exactly right. We are not like Snoopy in the sense that we actually control our environment to some extent. Some of our environment we can't control, from sort of things that happen to us, but we also are in this dynamic state with our world where we can influence what's happening. And I think, that's where it's really profound. So, there's our built environment. So that things like our green spaces, which is fascinating. And I cover a lot of that in the book, how even things like green spaces can reduce community violence, can reduce, actually, it's been tied to reduce depression prescriptions in neighborhoods, irrelevant of income, actually. And then there's also our social environment. And this is where I need every person who's on this call to sort of realize that this is part of the call of this work. And I imagine it's part of the call of the work that you're doing too. And a big part of that has to do with things like fairness, like how do we treat one another? I imagine that comes up a lot with the Dairy Kindness Institute.
Absolutely. So, and one of the important messages in the book is the way that kindness, compassion, living in a fair social world affects people's physical and mental well-being. And the absence of those things degrades their physical health and their mental health. So, Snoopy, I don't know a lot about goldfish. They school, but they seem to thrive reasonably well in isolation, as well as the elderly fish in the pond in San Diego illustrates, right? But we, of course, are social creatures, right? That is not just the 300,000 year history of our own species, but all the predecessor species for several million years before that were clearly very, very social, relied on the group in important ways. So talk a little bit about how those positive social relationships have a direct effect on health, and conversely, how things like discrimination, you mentioned fairness, right? So how racial prejudice, microaggression, these kinds of things impact people's well-being.
So I'm going to break that down a little bit because it's covering some broad areas. But I think one thing to just start out with, and it's thankfully actually one silver lining I feel like of the pandemic has been, one, we're all talking about mental health in a way that we weren't talking about it before. And I think, if we're able to create a better world going forward from this, that's going to be one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is also attending to our social relationships in the same way that we attend to other things like our diet and our exercise, because there's just all this data that shows that people that have positive social supports fare better with the stresses that come with life. And there's sort of ample things related to, not only physiological markers like, things like, our stress and cortisol levels that are measured, our blood pressure, our immune response, things like that. Even on a genetic level, it's pretty amazing now with epigenetics, which is like a super exciting area. And I suspect there are even some people on this call that are involved in this kind of research, but how our social environment is actually, it looks as though it's actually changing how the story of our DNA is told. And, that is a radical idea that is just incredible. And so we know that, people with positive supportive relationships fare better, and the more the better in the different areas of our lives. But, it really just takes one person. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I should point out for members of the audience that one of the really nice things that Kelli does in the book is give people sort of practical things, recipes, if you will, at the end of many of the chapters about how the reader can take tangible steps in their own lives to improve their own welfare and that of people around them. So there's a lot in what you said just now. I want to bookmark stress and epigenetics and community health for just a moment, because I think that's going to be a really important topic in our subsequent discussion. I want to come back to the issue of mental health and physical health. And I think you do a really nice job in the book of pointing out that not just sort of lay people on the street, but even within formal institutional medicine, mental health and physical health are divorced in important ways, and that mental health is really given short shrift relative to physical health. And that this really is in many ways both scientifically untenable, given what we know about the connections between the two, such that the effects are bidirectional. Physical health affects mental health affects physical health. And ultimately is bad for the individual patient when physicians partition things this way, and probably bad for society. So you're a psychiatrist, and yet you also have a degree in public health. You work in emergency rooms where you're seeing, I think, probably a lot of the less advantaged people in society. It's sadly where emergency rooms are where people often seek care in those circumstances. Tell us a bit about your own perspective on the relationship between mental health and physical health, and how you think we as a society and medical education, medical practice needs to reframe that relationship.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. That is the million-dollar question, because it is so apparent that, and it's sort of the elephant in the room a lot of times, particularly when it comes to our physical health, is mental health. There's clearly a connection, and study after study shows it. And, physiologically, there's a lot of sort of intriguing science going on in terms of, is it some sort of more systemic process? Does inflammation in the brain also cause inflammation in other areas? And which is a fun area of research in itself. But I think the thing that's important with all of this too is, the number one cause of disability around the world is mental health and depression. It impacts the world globally, but it pretty much receives only about 1% of all the aid when it comes to, and this is pre-pandemic data, in terms of trying to address mental health. So it feels like this sort of big thing that's out there. We also know that people with serious mental illness on average die almost 3 decades earlier than people without serious mental illness, which is totally unacceptable. And part of that has to do with, it's thought that, somewhat substandard medical care. And then it's also thought that it might have something to do with this underlying condition. So, or with the underlying condition that's causing both the mental health and the other physical condition. So, my job, and particularly as a doctor who's looking at the holistic patient, is really trying to think, what am I missing here? What else is going on with this person? Because, we've gotten increasingly myopic when it comes to medicine. You go to a different doctor for every single bit, it feels like sometimes. And where's the whole picture of that? And I think, there are a lot of people within medicine that are seeing this and want to address it. And it actually also ties into a big topic, which is burnout in healthcare, because, I think a lot of times it feels like you can fix the immediate problem, but you're not really helping the patient in the way that they necessarily need. And I think the more that we can kind of put all these supports into place, and it's going to need a team interdisciplinary effort, the better off we'll all be, whether we're on the caregiving side or on the patient side. And there's a fine line between those two.
Yeah, so if I could just pick up on that and editorialize a little bit, especially if we have any med students in the audience. So I've spent a little bit of time in clinical settings as an observer, and one of the things you mentioned, physician burnout. This is a huge problem. In the United States spends more per capita on health than any other, highly developed country, and yet has poorer health outcomes. So clearly that money is not being efficiently allocated. And yet at the same time, despite the high prestige and financial rewards of the practice of medicine, the personal rewards seem to be diminishing. And it strikes me, I don't think this is an original observation at all. In fact, it's clinical colleagues who have shared this with me, that really one part of the problem is that lack of the whole person approach that you described, right? So if you're treating the kidney in room 309, you aren't having the interpersonal experience. You're not seeing the life history of the individual that you're treating, and you're not experiencing potentially the emotional rewards of, being able to help someone. You're fixing something, right? You're a mechanic in that sense. So potentially, both patients and providers really can benefit from viewing mental and physical health in the context of social connections between people. The providers are humans too, right? And the material or status rewards clearly are insufficient to maintain the positive motivation for a substantial fraction of providers today.
Yes. So first I want to say I love medicine. I think it's a most fabulous profession. And for people who are on the call, I think, a big reason I wrote this book is because I love my profession, and I love for what it stands for, and the possibility of really focusing on health and how we can do that better. And when I say health, I mean that in the broadest possible term. And that also just got at, the question that really drove me from the time I was a student and I started seeing patients on the wards was, what are we missing in medicine? Because it makes no sense. You see patients with the same diagnosis, and one goes on to, function and feel well, the other patient dwindles. And it's like, what else is going on that we're missing? And, part of it is mental health. And then a big portion of it is our social world. And that's where it felt like, this is an important conversation to be having in our hospitals. It's important. And I'm so grateful for the field of public health that, all the minds that come together to think about this. And then I'm really grateful for the work that you do, and for the Baderi Kindness Institute, and everything that's happening outside in society, because, I think that's where you realize, we've got these population level studies, but it really comes down to our individual actions. And I forgot to share one statistic, and that's it. As a doctor, I was absolutely shocked that when it comes to our health, it turns out that, overall, well, quality medical care is important for every single human being. It probably only accounts for about 10 to 20% of our overall health status. And that's pretty shocking because the other mix includes somewhat our genetics, but also not as much as we thought. And then our social world. And that's where we get it, all these connections and kindness and the importance that's really a part of health.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a bit. The way that the presence of social support, the presence of a kind and caring circle and then larger community affects health. If you could maybe share with the audience a few, I mean, as I said, the volume is encyclopedic, so I don't think time allows us to go through many examples, but just a few of the examples of the way in which those positive social relationships have a direct measurable effect on health. And conversely, the way that things like discrimination, prejudice, and so on adversely affect health.
Sure. So you're absolutely right too, because the thing is, it's like I wrote the book, I put in hundreds of studies, and even since then, more studies have come out. And I feel like this year with the pandemic, we all got a social awakening with this. So actually related to that, I think one thing that's important to note when it comes to fairness, the pandemic really shone a spotlight on a lot of the social inequities that are out there. And one of it was in terms of COVID infection rates. And we know that in the US, there were three times higher infection rates in predominantly Black counties than in white counties, and a mortality rate that was 6 times higher. So that's just an example of, it doesn't biologically make sense. So that means there's something else in the mix. And we know from all the other research that a lot of it has to do with what's known as a social gradient. So when you look at, there's all this data, and it's shocking. When you, like in New York City, where I am in Greenwich Village, you'd hop on the train and you go, maybe 20 minutes and 5 miles north, and suddenly everything changes in terms of, life expectancy, different challenges that people are facing, and and waistlines, like things you shouldn't have, like things that shouldn't be like that are quite apparent. And it's in every city, in every country around the world, looking at these social gradients. And it's in things like maternal mortality, like in Chicago, within a 10-mile difference, even though everyone has access to world-class hospitals, there is a tremendous drop-off in maternal mortality, or in fetal mortality. So it's just, and actually maternal mortality as well. So, it basically says we need to do better. And the reason for this underlying, a lot of it has to do with sort of structural programs that were put into place that at face value sounded good, but things like redlining has, that was put into place in the late 1930s to try to help people stay in their homes, ended up having very many discriminatory practices that we're still seeing the repercussions from today.
So I think, many of the members of the audience might say, well, those are sort of structural policy issues. I, as an individual member of society, I might recognize, wrongs, whether intentional or otherwise, that have been done in the past. I can cast a vote. I can write my representatives. But those are big things, and that's sort of beyond the scope of what I, as an individual, can do. And I think rather than be satisfied with that, what your book does a really nice job of is showing that the individual actions that each of us take on an interpersonal level ripple outward, right? That society is nothing but a collection of individuals. And each of us is both influenced by and the producer of the social environment, right? So ultimately, I think there are many pragmatic steps that people can take that you do a great job of detailing in the book: organizations that they can join, ways that they can interact with others in the world around them. Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned stress, you mentioned epigenetics. You've mentioned the consequences, the intergenerational consequences of policies that were enacted decades ago. Let's talk about that in the context specifically of health, biology, and human mental and physical health. So epigenetics, share with the audience, if you would, just a little bit about the social influences on the health of subsequent generations.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that. One thing I just want to say, because I think it is so important for every person who's listening, is this idea that we all play a leadership role when it comes to health. And I think, if you walk away with something tonight, that's it, that your actions really matter. Even small actions make a difference. The things you notice, the things that you respond to, the ways that you can do good in the world really matter. And, in the book, I sort of try to organize it by the individual and sort of rippling out, whether it's communities, whether it's home life, and whether it's things like our schools and workplaces, like the way that you're interacting with other people is actually having this tremendous ripple effect. So even though it feels sometimes like somebody should do something about this,
Right.
It turns out it's you. So it's all of us, actually. And I think, I think that's really powerful in itself. So, I mean, obviously, this is a big one when we think about sort of structural things that are in place that have been unfair. So we know that, we know from lots and lots of data at this point that inequities impact health, and, racial inequities, gender inequities, all the different forms of inequities impact us, and they raise stress levels. We know that, also this impacts our neighborhood, kind of coming back to the goldfish idea that, if for kids who live in stressful neighborhoods, there have been studies that have been done in New Orleans that show they actually have shorter telomeres for if they're living in a neighborhood with like lots of broken glass and trash and stress and fear. And so telomeres are this important part related to epigenetics that are at the end of our DNA. And they're sort of like the protective, is it eaglets that are at the end of shoelaces that over time tend to shorten. And they've been correlated with lifespan. And, starting out life with shorter telomeres puts you at risk of all different types of chronic diseases. So, but the thing is, when we think about those neighborhoods, that's also something we can take action about, right? Like we can organize a community meeting. We can put together a group of parents who want to do a cleanup. We can start to think about ways we could beautify our neighborhoods. We know, again, the data around things like planting trees, greening empty lots actually has a profound impact on the stress levels of the people around who are living around. So I think that's where it gets important. So not to give up hope, but a big thing is also just awareness. I think for a lot of people who live in places where they're not necessarily feeling the impact of this every day, also thinking about where we live in our cities as whole organisms. We can't just think of them as individual neighborhoods. We are all part of this collective. And what can we do to, one, get to know our city, and two, help out people that are, and come up with ideas to help make each city a great place to live.
Yeah, and critically, I think it's important to note here. So it's easy to sort of to distance oneself from situations that are unfavorable, and in some ways to see unsupportive or self-interested behavior as sort of someone else's problem, right? Those people don't treat each other right in that neighborhood, and that's the reason that they have crime. That's the reason that they have, broken windows, what have you, right? There's really interesting work, some done in the Netherlands, and then the complement that we've done at UCLA, that essentially shows that while there are a few true saints in the world and there are a few true sinners, most of us are very plastic, and we respond even on a moment-by-moment basis to cues influencing our behavior about how likely other people are to be kind, supportive, cooperative towards us, right? so that when we see in other people's actions or the legacy of their actions, things like, graffiti, trash, boarded up windows and so on, that other people are behaving in a self-interested way, we ourselves become more self-interested, right? So there's a downward spiral where our own actions are then influencing other people. But happily, and this is a bunch of work that we've done at UCLA, including some in West Los Angeles, some on campus, right? The opposite is also true, right? So even very brief, just 2 minutes of exposure to someone being altruistic makes people more altruistic themselves, right?
Yeah.
And of course, then you can get a knock-on effect, right? Where if someone's kind, your kindness in turn inspires someone else's kindness. And I think that, while participation in community planning, community revitalization, policy, local governance is all really, really important. That can feel overwhelming at times to people. And just understanding that you're being kind to someone else will potentially shape how kind they are to someone else in turn, and that in effect over time will change the structure of your community. I think that's a really, really empowering observation.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And it reminds me of your fabulous studies about how kindness is contagious, just showing a video of somebody doing a kind deed.
Right. Just watching a stranger being altruistic to strangers for 2 minutes,
Yes.
people feel inspired, they feel uplifted, they feel more optimistic about humanity, all things which, as your book documents, are good for their health, both physical and mental, right? And really importantly, they become more altruistic themselves, right? They are more likely to, we pay participants for their participation, and we give them the opportunity to donate a portion of their payment to the UCLA Children's Hospital, right? The more uplifted people are by seeing a stranger. It's not someone who's helped them. They're not grateful for being, the beneficiaries. They've simply observed it, right? That in turn motivates them to, to donate sometimes even more than we have paid them for their participation, right? When we first started doing this research, one of my research assistants came to me and said, "We have an accounting problem." And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Well, the numbers don't add up. Look, these people are giving more than we paid them. So obviously we must have made a mistake somewhere." And I said, no. That's just how strong, this experience is, right? So we're all, there are true saints in the world, and there are also true sinners, people who are unconditionally altruistic, or people who are unconditionally, self-interested and antisocial. But most of us are neither of those, and we influence others and are influenced by others in turn.
Well, I think you're so right. And, it's actually quite remarkable how kind and how many things go right in society. We tend to focus on the things that are not going well, but there's a lot also positive that is happening. And I have to say, I just love your study, because for me, some of the most fun science is when something looks like it's wrong with the study design. Like, why are we getting more money than we have an accounting problem? But in fact, it was just that people were even more generous, or like with the rabbit study, the idea was just that, here they thought it was a mistake. And in fact, it was actually something new and novel. And actually, that's the story of stress too. The individual who, Dr. Cellier, who he thought that he was finding a mistake when he was studying the stress response, because he kept finding the same response no matter what he gave, what toxin he gave. Right. And he was about to quit science when he realized, oh, actually, this is really important. So anyway, I think keeping curious, keeping kind, realizing that those actions make a difference, and also recognizing we're all human beings. And, my kids like to remind me, I wrote a book on kindness. Sometimes they're probably downstairs listening to this right now, but that idea that, to also, when you mess up, and we also know people are more likely to mess up when they're tired or stressed themselves. But when you pause for a moment, and it's really important, because even 10 seconds of a pause seems to make a difference at being kinder for whatever situation you're about to head into. So, the more that we can remind ourselves that those things make a difference, and our actions really do matter. People are watching and it's impacting them. We're just such profoundly social creatures.
Right. I mean, you know, I think I can say with confidence that probably no one watching this right now would walk down the street and punch a stranger, right? And yet, you know, an unkind word, you know, an aggressive move on the freeway, that's impacting their welfare.
Yeah.
That's, you know, and potentially having physical, you know, damage to them in the same way that you know, an action of assault would. So, you know, that kind of understanding how we affect each other is really important. So I see that Vicki is joining us again. Vicki, do you have questions from the audience for us?
I do. Before I pose those to you, I just want to thank you both for sharing your contagious kindness with all of us, your kindness in accepting our invitation to participate in tonight's program. We are very grateful. Thank you for sharing all this wisdom with us. We have a lovely comment and a question from Sasha. She says, my 8-year-old daughter was sitting next to me as you told the rabbit study story, and even she understood that kindness affects mental health. Lucky that her teacher talks about kindness on Mindful Mondays. I love that. How are we introducing these ideas to children and others in our society? What can we do to help?
Oh, I love that question. So thank you, Sasha, and to your family for asking that. Yeah, so well, one, I think just being aware that the behaviors we model really matter, and being mindful of this in school. I think you know, it gets at that. Well, actually, I mean, we can just sort of think about for a second, when we see someone else doing something kind, or the last kind thing that happened to us that we saw or did, how that impacted our emotional state. You know, it makes people feel a sense of belonging. It makes people usually feel valued and cared for and supported. And so just, you know, encouraging these kinds of things in schools. Part of my work involves working with schools and teachers to implement some of these activities. And also thinking about sometimes where unkindness comes from, because, you know, a lot of times there's a lot more going on in the story than we realize. And which can also be helpful for dealing with what look like unkind actions. Because they, you know, as you mentioned, Dan, people don't just like walk down the street and randomly punch someone. There's usually a whole series of events that's going on before the incident occurs. And so how do we train ourselves to get better at sort of recognizing what's about to bubble over, try to prevent some of that, help people feel connected, feel a sense of belonging. And there's so much work to do.
And I think if I could add,
Yeah.
you know, Kelli does a wonderful job of helping us to find ways to recognize the humanity in others, right? And in fact, I laughed out loud at one point because you in the book you report a heuristic that you use when driving, which is almost identical to one that my wife uses. So Kelli says when someone is tailgating her, she says, what happened in their life that led them to this, right? That is, instead of saying, I'm angry because you are aggressing against me or putting me in danger, right? Saying, what's going on with the other person? My wife taught me, I mean, Los Angeles famous for its traffic, right? My wife taught me years ago, her little heuristic is when someone is driving aggressively on the road, she says, well, maybe they have a child in the hospital, right? Like they're trying to get there. That is, if I were them, I would be doing what they're doing. So instead of, God, jerk, you know, what a bad human being, right? It's, oh, I see how they're a person like me. I can understand what's going on maybe with them and be more, you know, understanding and compassionate towards others instead of just responding with aggression.
Oh, yeah. So I think that you've asked the powerful question, and it actually can help solve so many conflicts, which is, you know, what happened to that person or what is happening to that person, as opposed to what's wrong with that person. And, you know, that's critically important, and it can help us stay cool in the moment. And it can also help us think a little bit bigger about how ways that we might be able to help. You know, one of my mentors, Dr. Lloyd Sutter, who's at Columbia, he always talks about how behavior serves a purpose. And, you know, its behavior doesn't come out of nowhere. There's something usually behind it that's going on. And if you're curious and ask questions and try to understand what that is, because we didn't get into this, but a big piece of sort of kindness and how the world works when it comes to health is trust. And, we know that feeling listened to and valued just as a human being actually increases levels of trust. So, when we feel like society is breaking down, it's, everything's not going the way we feel, just actually the power of listening and trying to understand can go a long way, even when you're sitting in, I guess, is it the 405 traffic?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We're famous, aren't we, for that 405 traffic? We have a question here from Melinda. Could you say a few words about how the pandemic and quarantines have adversely affected physical health and mental health, I might add, and share some strategies for reacclimating to more social interaction in a way that's cognizant of the challenges of doing so after such a significant stressful period of time?
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, reentry is a big question right now for a lot of people.
Oh, it is. It's really, it's presenting new and different challenges for sure. But I guess when it comes to sort of re-entry and fear of going out, I suppose I've just taught me the hashtag FOGO is also just being sort of gentle with yourself when it comes to coming, starting to reconnect with people. And I actually, there's a piece of me that also really values that we've gotten okay with awkwardness in a different kind of way than before the pandemic, and that it's okay to be awkward. It's okay to not have things be perfect. It's okay to ask people how people are doing really, and really kind of supporting each other through this, because it's hard for everybody. Another big piece of it that we're seeing, and I just had a conversation with a neurologist about this, is increase it, people are starting to notice cognitive impairments from being in their homes for so long and being socially isolated. And so doing as much as you can to sort of think about re-engaging. There's all this awesome data that I put the initial studies into the book, but it's really cool about purpose and health, and thinking about how you can make a difference. And we also know that, like, to feel good, do good. So think about ways you could, something that you're passionate about, that you care about, that you want to motivate you to get out, and see if you can call a friend to do it together now that people are vaccinated and starting to meet up again. And I think for me, the big thing was also hugs. I really, really missed all those hugs, and I'm so grateful to be able to do that again.
If I could just footnote Kelly's remarks a little bit. So, absolutely looking for ways to do good and feel good as a consequence is great. Again, I want to encourage people not to be intimidated by a high bar. So the Badari Kindness Institute is a supporter of an initiative that began here in Los Angeles called the Just Say Hello initiative. And the idea is to start to gradually erode racial prejudice simply by saying hello to other strangers whom you might otherwise, in other circumstances, not have acknowledged, right? I mean, we live in a huge society. Many of us live in urban settings where, we essentially ignore the people around us. And I think, face masks, social isolation, safer at home, all of these things have inclined us to pull back, right? And not, acknowledge the humanity of others. So just a simple head nod, a smile, a hello to someone on the street, I think is going to make you feel better, be healthier, and have an impact on others as well.
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that initiative too. We're talking little simple things like eye contact, a little help, whatever you see around you. And what's so nice is you have hundreds of opportunities during the day to, do these little acts of kindness, essentially. And actually, there are studies that show neighborhoods where people say hello, they actually tend to feel a greater sense of community and connection. So it's funny, because I know this data, I am, aggressively saying hello to people on the street. And I have to also say, I probably get like a 20 to 30% response in New York City. But I do know that just the act of doing it, and the definition of kindness is doing something generous just for the sake of doing that act.
Yeah,
so so just be aware you might get some no's, but at the same time, by putting yourself out there, you're making a difference.
Yeah, I would say do not underestimate, the impact that even a few words can have. At the height of the pandemic here in the U.S., I had a telephone interaction with someone doing, support for an online business. I don't know where she was in the country. She was clearly working hard under challenging circumstances, and she was very helpful with me. And at the end of it, I just said, thank you for working so hard and being so helpful, during this really challenging times. I really appreciate it. And she broke down and started crying. And she said, no one has ever said that to me before, right? No one has ever thanked me for doing my job, right? And I thought that's remarkable, right? I mean, this is not, I didn't, I wasn't, going to war for a just cause. I wasn't, donating a kidney. All I did was be a decent person to this other person who I, had an anonymous interaction with, and it clearly made a difference, right? And I learned that from someone else. That's not something that I thought of, right? I'm not taking credit for that because I had similar experiences at the receiving end myself.
Thank you both. I think in the morning when we're out walking with our dog, when I say good morning to everybody we pass, sometimes people look surprised.
Yes.
Oh, yes, well, good morning. And it does really make you feel better. Not just to be acknowledged, but even the act of saying it. So thank you for articulating that so well. We'll end with one last question. This is from Kathy, who owns bunnies. But she's asking back to the original study, how did the research team benefit from their care of the bunnies? How did it affect them? I just think that's a wonderful question to end on, because how they gave kindness, how were they affected by the way the animals responded to them?
I have to say a really special part of writing the book was actually the opportunity to meet with Dr. Bob Neeram and his lovely wife, Marilyn, and talk about how it had changed their life over the years, and what an incredible family. And, they said at the time, the idea was very woo-woo and out there. And they said, this is science, actually. This kindness is science. And we need to start thinking about going forward, how we implement that. And actually, Dr. Neeram has left it. He passed away, unfortunately, at the beginning of the pandemic. And he has left an incredible legacy, though. And one of the great things is he realized we're a better society when we're kinder to each other and when it's more equitable for people. So he created a series of education programs for kids in Georgia where he was living to try to, raise the bar for everybody. And it turns out education is a great thing to do for health. And we're all doing it this evening by participating in this. So, but that was actually one of the big takeaways, is it changed everything. And I have to say, writing the book, I knew a lot of the data beforehand, but it's absolutely changed my life in that sense too, is you just realize, your relationships with people really matter. It really matters for your health. So do what you can to, create some positive space in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you for giving us the gift of this book. For educating us about kindness, both Dan, Kelly. You've given us so much to think about, and so many ways that we can do our part to make the world a kinder, better place. So thank you for that. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be part of our open mind. I want to thank everybody that has tuned in today, and we look forward to seeing you on June 15th. When we welcome father-daughter Justies, Doctors Justy, for a talk about wisdom, very related. So thank you so much, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you.